Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Remus. On behalf of America's Job Exchange, thanks for joining us today for How to Prepare for OFCCP Manager Interviews. Before we get started, I have a few notes. Please use the Q&A feature to submit questions at any time. We're going to plan to address your questions during the presentation as we're able. If we don't get to your question today, we'll get back to you via email. Just allow a few days for that response. And since we do get this one question a lot, yes, we will be mailing a copy of the slides presented today and a link to the recording to you in the next few days. Finally, after this event, a short survey will pop up. If you can take a minute to let us know what you thought of today's presentation, we greatly appreciate it. And now, I'd like to introduce today's fantastic speakers. Please welcome Alissa Horvitz, member attorney and co-founder of Roffman Horvitz, PLC. Alissa focuses her practice on representing clients in various matters before the OFCCP, preparing for and defending OFCCP audits and on-site visits, responding to OFCCP information requests, and conducting live and in-person training seminars on OFCCP compliance. Along with Alissa, we have with us Nora Evans and James McCauley. Both are associate attorneys with Roffman Horvitz, focusing on the preparation and review of affirmative action plans for federal contractors and federal government contractors, respectively. Thanks to you all for being here. I'll turn the presentation over to you, Alissa.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and we're happy to participate in today's web seminar. Our agenda for today is we're going to talk a little bit about the OFCCP compliance review or audit process, and then we're going to proceed to go into the distinction between manager interviews and employee interviews. We're going to talk about the 4 common interview types, and then go to overall manager interview tips and considerations. And I do want to note at the outset of this presentation, we developed this presentation before OFCCP began doing its Section 503 focused review on-sites. And so the gist of today's presentation is really geared towards an employer that has been undergoing a routine compliance review with OFCCP. And as part of the routine compliance review, OFCCP seems to be identifying some type of issue. And our presentation today about how you prepare a manager for those types of interviews was really designed for the routine OFCCP compliance review process. I will note, though, that we have prepared a couple of our clients to meet with OFCCP as part of the Section 503 focused review process. So we've done the employee prep and the manager prep in a different context. And we're happy to provide some guidance and assistance. So if there are organizations listening into today's call and you participated in the web seminar because you thought that it was going to really hone in on a Section 503 on-site, we're not really going to hone in on it. But that's not to say I'm more than happy if you ping me by email. I will try to provide you with some perhaps supplemental guidance on what it means to prepare a manager or interview or get employees ready for interviews dealing in the Section 503 context. So having said that, I want to explain what we view to be the typical OFCCP compliance review process. The organization gets a scheduling letter, and it responds to the letter by sending in the materials 30 days after it receives the letter. We call that the desk audit submission. And then the next phase are information requests. And OFCCP in this phase is really trying to understand what is it that the contractor just sent in with all this data. And in the information request phase, that's typically when the OFCCP will contact the employer and say, we have this compensation data from you. We'd really like to talk to someone in your organization who can help us to understand a little bit about your compensation philosophy and structure. And so the compensation policy interview tends to occur in the information request phase. Then, when OFCCP has made its way through all of the data and asked all of its questions, and you've sent back all of your answers, and you've given it some supplemental pieces of information, if OFCCP still feels that it wants to come on site, which is the third phase, it's typically because it thinks it sees something in your data. Sometimes you'll hear the phrase, we found indicators in your data. And so an indicator is, in OFCCP's mind, there's something that needs to get followed up on. Something that the employer is doing is not proportional for minorities or for females or one race over another. And in order for OFCCP to be satisfied that the employer still is complying with principles of equal opportunity, it wants to come on site. And so in the on-site, we tend to get into the interview that talks about the specifics of why certain compensation decisions were made. That's the employee's supervisors. Then we get into the overall hiring process. If OFCCP sees adverse impact in hiring, they may want to talk to a recruiter. If they see impact in the selection process, they may want to talk to hiring managers. And then just to round out, in our view, there are two other phases. Once the OFCCP is done with the on-site, they often have more information requests because they learned a lot while they were on site, and they want more information and policies. And then at the end, they're going to issue some type of concluding document, either a notice of compliance. If they think they see discrimination, they might issue a predetermination notice and then go on to issue a notice of violations. And so that's sort of how we're going to approach the topic today. And the reason why we make a distinction between a manager versus an employee interview, we view a manager interview to be any interview regarding the individual's role in making or implementing the employer's policy. You can have people who do not have a managerial title who nonetheless are making decisions for the employer. They could be interviewed in their capacity as someone whose answer will bind the organization to some legal principle. So you could have an executive assistant who is being interviewed in a management capacity if that person is, responsible for inputting certain information into a database, and the database is critical to the employer's defense. An employee interview, by contrast, is an interview regarding how the employer's policies affect the individual employee and his or her peers. You can have managers, directors, vice presidents who are being interviewed in their capacity as an employee, not a manager in certain circumstances. And the reason why the distinction is important is that the role of the company and its representatives in preparing interviewees is different. When I am preparing someone to be interviewed by OFCCP in a managerial capacity, I get to prep them, and I prep them very differently than if I'm speaking to someone who is being interviewed in his or her capacity as an employee. When OFCCP conducts a manager interview, I, as the attorney, get to sit in. I get to take notes. I get to ask questions. I get to facilitate and help. I don't get to do that in an employee interview. Those are confidential interviews, and OFCCP is not going to allow the employer's representatives to participate. And so with that structure and framework, what I'm now going to do is turn it over to James. Right, and James is going to take the topic of the first type of interview, a compensation structure and policy interview.
Thank you. And so in the compensation and structure policy interview, what the OFCCP really wants to find out is what sort of framework and factors are driving your compensation structure. When managers are being interviewed on this topic, they really need to be ready to explain the groups used to analyze pay and why it makes sense to group these employees together and not put other employees in the group. It's important that at this point we've submitted a series of data points that can be used to differentiate the employees and the compensation. And our submissions generally include a description of the way the OFCCP should be treating the different variables and creating the pay groups. It's important that the manager who's being interviewed understands the data fields that we submitted. So it's really best to run through the submission column by column to ensure that the manager understands what each heading represents and the meaning of each data point in the field. Compliance officers will ask a series of questions about the policy for compensation at each phase where it's set or adjusted. This is generally at the initial hire, when annual raises are given, and any promotions or other changes. The OFCCP will want to know what factors are considered in each of these instances. It's important the manager notes which factors are considered that can be difficult to maintain in a database or quantify. For example, a policy may account for prior experience when setting initial pay for a new hire. It's easy to quantify the years of experience, but it's not as easy to quantify the relevance or quality of the experience. the manager being interviewed should also be ready to explain the policies behind additional compensation opportunities. This includes things like overtime and bonuses. The manager should be ready to say how they're awarded and calculated, but also who's eligible to receive them. The OFCCP will want to ensure that people aren't being denied the chance to earn this additional compensation based on their race or gender. And as we just discussed, the manager being interviewed should be prepared to discuss the overall approach and policies regarding compensation, but should also be ready to tell OFCCP about how those policies are being internally reviewed. The regulations require employers to conduct an in-depth analysis to evaluate their compensation structures and flag any disparities. The manager needs to be ready to explain how the employer conducts this review and identifies if there are disparities in their compensation structure. He or she should be ready to explain how the employer identifies race, gender, and ethnicity disparities when there are comparators, but also how it ensures equity in instances where there are not comparators. And searching for disparities alone does not address inequitable pay policies, because in roles with single incumbents and hires into new roles, there won't be a disparity so much as an inequitable initial pay. At Roffman Horvitz, we provide our clients with privileged compensation analysis in their affirmative action plans. And other employers may have different methods of identifying disparities, but it is not enough to simply conduct the analysis. The manager should also be ready to explain how the employer actually reviews the analysis. It's not enough to just put together the report and file it away. One caveat is that if a pay analysis is not prepared under the attorney-client privilege, the OFCCP will likely ask for the analysis. Finally, the manager should be ready to explain what policies and procedures inform decision-makers' decisions. After understanding the compensation structure and policies, the manager should be ready to explain how this structure is communicated to the people making the compensation decisions and how it's implemented. And that brings us to our next type of interview. Oh, sorry, no.
Nope, pitfalls.
Pitfalls, sorry about that.
Pitfalls, things to watch out for.
So when preparing managers for this interview, there's a few common pitfalls and things that managers are going to want to avoid in their responses. An obvious mistake is the failure to differentiate employees. For example, employees in the same title across different departments may perform very different roles, and the OFCCP should be informed of this. Another mistake is to oversimplify the factors used to determine compensation. For the purpose of the interview, it's necessary to give broadly applicable policies and practices, but make sure the manager reserves room for exceptions. Some factors considered when setting pay may be specific only for a specific job or employee. So it's important to use terms like generally and not suggest that the broader factors used to determine compensation are absolute. Also, be ready to explain what an AAP job group is and what it's not. OFCCP may want to use the AAP job groups to analyze pay, but these groups will often not capture all of the different factors affecting pay and may group employees together who are not good for comparison in how their pay is set. It's also important to note that the OFCCP has released a directive, 2018-05, to explain how OFCCP will evaluate compensation and what sort of factors they'll generally consider. The directive provides a good starting point for understanding what areas the OFCCP may see as having a disparity, but it's not the end point. It can be interpreted differently and may be difficult to predict what they'll find, so it's not absolute.
Great. And so before we advance to the next slide, though, I would like to address two questions that have come in so far. One asks, when do you, as the attorney, participate in OFCCP's interview? When do you prep everyone and stay behind the scenes with the company's in-house counsel or HR being the person in the room with the manager? And in all candor, it really depends on the nature of OFCCP's inquiry and the expertise of the HR person and in-house counsel in dealing with OFCCP and the types of issues that are presented. The more that I am reassured that an in-house counsel has dealt with OFCCP in the past, really has very good skills with data and Excel and knows his or her way around the issues that OFCCP is dealing with, the more I'm happy to back off. the more that the organization is unfamiliar with how OFCCP operates, may not be familiar with the district director, personalities, the more inclined I am to kind of push my way in. But that really is very flexible. I think that OFCCP has come around to understand that when a manager is being interviewed, it's the company's right to have counsel there. And, I don't view myself as someone who spends my entire time there objecting to what OFCCP is asking for. I'm very much a facilitator and a note taker to making sure that my clients' defenses are being presented. And then another question came in, do employees have the right to have a representative present for these interviews? They do, especially if they are unionized employees and they want a union representative to participate in the interview. They can do that. I will tell you that as a matter of practice, however, if the employee says to OFCCP, I'm not going to do the interview unless I get to sit in with someone else, the OFCCP is going to spend a fair amount of time trying to understand why that is. And I do. I spend a lot of time trying to reassure employees about OFCCP's, confidential interview. It's going to be a very uphill battle for the company to have a representative sitting in with an employee. A translator is different. If you have employees who are not fluent in speaking English and the auditor doesn't speak the employee's language, the OFCCP has been more willing to have a non-managerial translator sitting in. And also, just don't forget, you cannot retaliate. You cannot go up to your interviewees and say, what did the OFCCP ask you? What did you say? The OFCCP takes a very hard line on issues of retaliation. Okay, and with that, we'll go to the next type of interview, employee supervisors.
Right. And so the OFCCP will want to conduct interviews of employee supervisors for similar reasons than why it wants to understand the policy and structure, but here it really wants to understand how the supervisors are applying these policies and why specific decisions are made. So the interview will have aspects that are more specific about decisions rather than the overall concepts, and it's very important to prep the supervisor to answer questions about any ideas or areas where the OFCCP may have identified a disparity. When addressing relevant comparators, we want to push the OFCCP closer to a Title VII standard and determining whether specific comparators are in fact similarly situated rather than a comparison that's broader and easier to statistically compare. The managers should be prepared to answer questions about what role they play in each stage of compensation. So that's the initial setting of pay, when performance reviews are conducted, and how they affect annual raises. Promotions or transfers and pay at any pay setting at any promotion or transfer. And then when pay can be adjusted based on market factors, such as wanting to retain an employee, and other factors that may affect pay and in any of these instances. Sometimes the supervisor will not be involved in some of these decisions, and that's what they should answer. When they do play a role, they should be prepared to explain how they specifically make the decision. What sort of policies do they rely on? What process do they follow? And what sort of training have they had to inform their decision in this area? Right, and just to make sure, any type of pay change is something that OFCCP is looking at. Remember, under Title VII law, OFCCP focuses on the employer's decision. So a lot of times they're going to be focusing on what decisions this manager makes and what factors he or she uses. So it's very much focused about the decision. And so some of the issues that the manager should be ready to address are explaining especially whether employees are in fact similarly situated and why they made decisions differently in different circumstances. As the person who made the decision to pay one employee more than another or give a low performance rating, what was the factor that affected the decision and how did they come to it? Why would it be different when talking about other employees? So how the manager should be prepared to answer these questions will depend in part on whether the OFCCP is focusing on a large group or a small group. In both instances, again, it's very important to leave room for exceptions to any rule or policy articulated. And in broader groups, it may be more important to articulate why different subgroups of employees are evaluated through different factors and considerations. Smaller groups, the focus may be on the weight given to specific factors evaluated or how they're measured. To help supervisors prepare, it may be helpful to ask them what employee qualities are valuable and what will lead to higher pay or performance reviews in a position. This is a good way to get the manager thinking about what specific factors they're considering and what leads them to making decisions.
And the other pattern that we have observed is that OFCCP really never goes into why did you choose to pay this person this amount, why did you choose to pay that person that amount. They tend to stay much more broad in their questions. What are the factors that you use in making your decision? It rarely gets into a, look at the file for this employee under your supervision and look at the file for that employee and explain the minutia. So that's not a pattern that we've seen in our compensation reviews. They've pretty much stayed at the high level. Okay, so we're going to go to pitfalls.
Okay. And the pitfalls here, too, are similar to those discussed in the context of policy and structure, but again, this is asking about the supervisor's interviews, so they should be ready to answer accordingly. The supervisor should be warned not to answer questions too broadly. This interview is about how they have made decisions and what factors affected their decisions. So giving an answer based on a company-wide policy may not properly differentiate between differently situated employees. This also means that they should leave room for exceptions. The supervisor should be careful to use words like generally and leave room for instances where a decision was made based on factors affecting a specific employee or a specific job title that couldn't be compared or applied more broadly to other job titles. The OFCCP may group employees together that are not similarly situated in practice, and the manager should be sure to explain why there are genuine differences between the compensation structures for different roles. Even if some factors could make the roles seem similar, other factors that the manager can articulate may show that employees' compensation is in practice determined differently. On that note, the supervisor should not concede that AAP job groups are an appropriate grouping to analyze pay. The OFCCP may wish to default to the job groups used in the affirmative action plan, but in many instances, this won't be appropriate. I'm now going to turn this over to Nora to discuss how to prepare managers for interviews regarding the hiring process.
Except we decided we were going to answer a few more questions before James turned it over to Nora, because we've got a few more questions and we'd like to try to address a few of them. So one of the questions came in, can employees refuse to be interviewed? Answer, yes. OFCCP may ask why. Can managers refuse to be interviewed? Yes, they can. Sometimes it's really not a matter of anything more than their work schedule just does not permit them to be available for OFCCP at the time. So you as counsel should be thinking about, do I really need this particular witness? And if I do, can I ask the manager whether another time would be more convenient? OFCCP, has been very willing to conduct interviews by telephone after an on-site if it can't get someone, if someone's on vacation, people who play an important decision-making role but who are simply just unavailable. OFCCP is very gracious in setting up a follow-up telephone call, and the attorney gets to sit in. The next question, what if OFCCP wants to interview a manager in the capacity as both a manager witness and an employee witness? What we've done in those situations is we've tried to ask the compliance officers to partition their questions. They often come with these pre-printed questionnaires. The compliance officers typically need ADD or assistant district director or district director approval in order to come to the on-site. These are the questions I want to ask this employer. Here's my questionnaire. Look over the questions. And they typically ask the same questions over and over of the manager witnesses. And if there is someone who needs to be interviewed in different capacities, We just simply ask OFCCP, you know, while we're in the room, ask your manager questions. When you're ready to switch over to employee questions, I'll leave the room. And your manager witnesses are typically prepared then to understand what the nature of their answers might be differently, you know, when you're not in the room. In focused reviews, has OFCCP asked any questions about compensation for individuals with disabilities? No, not in the ones that we've done. Let's see. Are there any more questions that I haven't answered? Oh yes, here's another one. The OFCCP always asks about factors that determine pay, but how much are they willing to engage in a conversation about the weight you give to the different factors and how the factors might be weighted differently in different circumstances? Great question, and that's the kind of question where the employer's counsel or representative needs to ask the follow-up. That's not going to be the type of question that OFCCP is going to include on its typical routine questionnaire. They are not getting into how much weight are different things valued and why. And so if the OFCCP is not doing such a great job of asking the right questions, you have to balance two different factors. One, is OFCCP going to give you, as counsel or as the representative, the notes? In many, many on-sites, OFCCP will tell you at the outset, and if they don't tell you, I ask. At the end of the interviews, are you going to type up your notes and give them to us so that we can edit them and annotate them, sign them, and send them back to you? And if the OFCCP says, yes, we're going to give you our notes, then in all candor, I'm not going to be interrupting OFCCP all interview long. I'm going to wait until we get the notes. And I am all too happy at the end of the OFCCP's notes to add a few questions of my own and have the witness answer them if the OFCCP is not getting around to this. If the OFCCP is missing the big picture, then yes, at some point the interview may need to get a little confrontational because as the employer's representative, I want to make sure that my witness is giving a very full and accurate and factually truthful answer. And if the OFCCP is missing major topics, that's the role of the lawyer, not necessarily the company, to do that. So, you know, the lawyer gets to be bad cop and the company gets to be good cop. Okay, and so with that, I am going to turn it over to Nora, and Nora is going to do the recruiter interview, a big one.
Thank you. So one of OFCCP's goals in interviewing recruiters is to understand the overall hiring process, including all the different steps. So when prepping a manager or a recruiter, you need to be cognizant of which jobs OFCCP is focused on. That is, has OFCCP honed in on indicators in hiring in particular job groups? Because the hiring process may be different for different jobs, and recruiters may undertake different steps for different types of roles. The recruiters will want to distinguish and explain how the process of recruiting or hiring may differ for different jobs. OFCCP will usually spend time asking about what the factors are that the employer uses to determine whether an applicant is qualified, and this is a very important bullet point. So for instance, some employers evaluate candidates based only on a resume, and a resume, if you think about it, is only what the candidate wants the employer to know about him or her. Whereas an actual application typically solicits the same information from every single person. So when an employer bases decisions on fields in an application, you tend to have apples to comparisons between one candidate and the next. OFCCP may want to know if some people have a resume and others don't, what role does the resume play? Oftentimes, the resume will expand on what it is that the candidate actually did in prior positions. The factors that the employer is using to determine whether the candidate is qualified may be an application alone, an application and a resume, or a resume alone. There also may be impressions of the resume that the recruiter is making even if it's not a listed factor. For instance, typos or errors in resumes reflect negatively on the candidate, especially for a job that requires good attention to detail, but employers don't say flat out in their job postings, make sure your resume doesn't have typos or errors, because it's an unwritten rule. But employers do form impressions about a candidate from something like that. Or, for instance, an employer won't say in a job posting, must have continuous work experience or good explanations for gaps in work experience. But when a recruiter is looking over someone's expression of interest in a position and sees that this person has huge gaps in their work history or has had 3 different jobs in the last 4 months, the recruiter is going to form an impression about this person's work history. OFCCP will also want to know, what is the recruiter's role in reviewing and screening applicants? Is the recruiter simply looking for basic qualifications and then passing on any candidate who meets those qualifications? Is the recruiter doing phone screens? You want to get all of this information from the recruiter during your preparation sessions. Your prep of the recruiter is very much about fact-finding, so that you can make sure during the course of OFCCP's interview that your witness is speaking to the entire process and not just a portion of the process. OFCCP sometimes doesn't know what it doesn't know, and it's the job of the employer's counsel to make sure OFCCP really understands fully and thoroughly and completely the entire hiring process. Another purpose of the interview is to learn about the employer's applicant tracking system, how the employer dispositions applicants, and what are some of the dispositions, etc. OFCCP will want to know whether the recruiters have been trained on the use of dispositions. Do the recruiters themselves understand concepts of adverse impact? What have the recruiters been trained on? Do they have access to race and gender information? Most of the time, the recruiters we deal with say that they don't do any work with adverse impact. They do understand that someone who puts together AAPs evaluates the data based on dispositions, and they understand the importance of dispositioning applicants accurately, but oftentimes they aren't the ones actually paying attention to race and gender. So, issues to address in recruiter interviews. It's important to distinguish between basic qualifications and other factors that differentiate candidates. So, for instance, a basic qualification may be education or some type of skill or experience, and preferred qualifications are in addition to those basic qualifications. It's the job of a recruiter to track which candidates have the basic qualifications and which have preferred qualifications in addition to those basic qualifications. What policies govern the recruiting and hiring process? A lot of employers have just an EEO policy, but some employers may have a policy that requires recruiters to do certain things in the applicant tracking system. If the employer has any policies post-offer about background checks, reference checks, drug tests, or anything like that, those may be relevant as well. OFCCP doesn't tend to spend much time on the third bullet, whether the actual hiring process for the jobs in question differed from the written policy or process. What OFCCP does tend to spend time on is if the employer submits data showing that there were different managers or different recruiters all hiring for the same job title. Is everyone doing things consistently in that case? When you have one recruiter assigned to all of a particular recruiting for one type of job, there tends to be more uniformity than when the multiple recruiters recruit for the same job titles. And we touched on these issues before, but again, OFCCP will want to know how recruiters ensure that equal opportunity in the hiring process is occurring. It will want to know the steps of the hiring process, and it will want to know about the meaning of applicant dispositions. Another issue that's important to evaluate when you're prepping your witness is, to what extent does the employer use contracted out recruiters? It's something you want to consider addressing, because when you use a contracted out recruiter, OFCCP will want to make sure that the contracted out recruiters understand the policies and processes and the need to collect race and gender information, protected veteran status, etc. It's a very big issue these days. When it comes to hiring issues and the employer uses executive search firms or temp agencies, OFCCP will want to know what the employer has communicated to those agencies, whether the agencies are in the system, whether they submit the information directly to the employer's applicant tracking system, et cetera, and how that whole process works. So recruiter interviews pitfalls to avoid. In order to explain the consequences of deviating from a requisition-based hiring model, you need to explain why a requisition-based model is helpful to the employer. OFCCP doesn't have the time, the energy, or the resources to evaluate employer data initially job title by job title, and OFCCP expects the contractor to have aggregated its hire and applicant data by job group. Nonetheless, the employer probably has very different applicant pools job by job. So even though we have to aggregate data for a desk audit submission, one of the strategies we employ in subsequent phases of a compliance evaluation is to unpack this aggregated data and control for requisition. Being able to go requisition by requisition, selection pool by selection pool, manager decision by manager decision can be a very important and useful strategy. But the only way this works is if the employer uses and maintains separate requisitions and has a good tracking system. If a recruiter starts talking about moving people from requisitions to other requisitions willy-nilly, it kind of destroys the requisition model, because someone might ask, why did you move some people from this requisition and not others? And it can get messy quickly. The second bullet point is fairly self-explanatory, and we touched on this before, but if OFCCP is evaluating very different types of jobs, the hiring process could be different for those jobs, and it's important to be able to explain those different processes and how they may be specific to each type of job. And as for the last bullet point, oftentimes OFCCP will start asking recruiters about things that aren't within their purview. A recruiter could get questions about something like running adverse impact analyses, and most of the time, recruiters aren't doing that. And it's important to emphasize to recruiters that it's okay to say, I don't know, in response to questions about things not in their realm of responsibility. It's actually better for them to say, I don't know, than to give answers that they aren't sure of. And now we get to the fourth type of manager interviewees, the hiring manager. So in these interviews, OFCCP wants to know, what is the manager's role? Does the manager screen candidates for qualifications, or are they already getting pre-screened candidates? Is the manager responsible for deciding who gets called in for an interview? Is the manager someone who simply participates in an interview? Do they just take part in a group interview? Do they fill out a form after the interview? Do they give the candidates a rating? Do they make the ultimate decision, or does someone else? Just being one person in a group interview who fills out a form or votes is clearly a very different responsibility than a manager who is the sole interviewer and the sole decision maker about a hire. It's important to prep managers to talk about how they memorialize the impressions they have about candidates, how they communicate these impressions, and how they preserve all of this information. What role do they have, if any, in dispositioning applicants? By the time it gets to an interview stage, most of the time, most of our clients' managers are simply providing a disposition of either candidate was recommended for an offer or more qualified candidates selected. And it's very important for hiring managers to be able to articulate how they ensure equal opportunity in their decision-making process. Do they have EEO training every year? How do they know about making decisions that are fair and non-discriminatory, et cetera?
And we're not necessarily saying that you have to have training every year. OFCCP, though, remember, when they do an audit, they have the authority, if they see adverse impact in hiring or compensation issues, to go 2 years back from the date of the letter. So when your managers can testify truthfully, oh yes, we've had refresher training in the 2-year window, that's a plus. When their answer is, I've never been trained on any EEO issue since coming to this organization, that would be a bad answer. So we're not necessarily advocating that you have to do it every single year. Every 2 years might kind of get you in the window for OFCCP. You know, every year would be great though, but that's not what we're saying.
As for the issues to address, we've touched on a lot of this, but again, a hiring manager will be expected to recall the process used to hire the employees in the jobs in question, and should be able to identify where records are stored and ensure that the employer has the records memorializing why certain candidates were selected and not others. A hiring manager should elaborate on his or her specific role in the hiring process, and should be able to talk about what type of equal opportunity training the employer has. As for factors other than qualifications that drive preferences between otherwise qualified candidates, there's no doubt that when managers interview candidates, they form impressions based on how casually someone was dressed, whether they were nervous, how well they could articulate ideas. Do any of these types of factors relate to how well someone can perform in the job? Some may and some not. But a hiring manager is ultimately trying to evaluate whether a candidate will be a good fit for a particular job, and there are other factors other than qualifications that come into play. For instance, for a job with a lot of client-facing work, a hiring manager may form a negative impression about an otherwise qualified candidate if the candidate was dressed too casually and had trouble articulating ideas during the interview. So for pitfalls to avoid in hiring manager interviews, the biggest pitfall for a hiring manager is having the manager talk about parts of the decision-making process that he or she takes no role in or has no actual knowledge about. Some hiring managers try to answer questions about parts of the process they don't take part in because they think they should know how that process works because of their position. But if something isn't the hiring manager's job, they don't need to answer, and they shouldn't. Saying they don't know because that isn't one of their responsibilities is fine. Some compliance officers come into an on-site not with an objective fact-finding mindset, but arrive thinking that they're trying to build a case against the employer to take the compliance review to the next step, a predetermination notice or finding of discrimination. They aren't supposed to view it this way, but sometimes they do. And if the manager witness or the employer's counsel doesn't articulate some of the basic qualifications for the jobs in question and no reasons why otherwise qualified candidates did not advance to the next step or were not chosen for hire, the employer is not going to have any information in that interview to rely on. So it's important to articulate those qualifications and factors.
Right, and that last point is important. If you find out at the beginning of an OFCCP onsite that OFCCP does not intend to give you its version of the manager notes, you're the one responsible for making sure that all of your witnesses are able to articulate what were the reasons that disqualified candidates from advancing further in the process. And that's a very big one, because OFCCP is not going to argue your defensive case for you. Okay, so then we have just, typical overall manager interview tips and considerations, with the biggest one being, please don't guess. It's okay to say, I don't remember, I don't know, and it is okay for certain questions to speak in generalities. You should be answering the question asked and not offer more information than is responsive to the question. And when I prep witnesses, I typically give the same prep that I do with my 16-year-old, who's a little tired of my prep by this time. But when you ask the question, do you know what time it is? The answer is not supposed to be 2:44. The answer is supposed to be yes. So I've gone through that kind of example with my teenager about when adults are questioning you to be listening to the question asked and how you're going to answer. And I'm not saying that you should be evasive, but if the OFCCP is going to ask you the question, do you know what time it is, you should simply say yes. And be circumspect about what documents your witnesses are offering up, because if you have not done a good prep, if you don't know the universe of documents, if you're not talking to the client about documents, you've never seen them before, and then all of a sudden in the interview, out comes the mention of a document that is, that you haven't looked at, OFCCP is likely to ask for it. And, you want to be careful about referencing documents that have not previously been provided to OFCCP. The role of counsel is important. For the most part, this is not like a deposition. This is not interruptive. It's not abrasive. The OFCCP is very much trying to fact find. The questions are typically very relevant to the investigation. They may not be thorough, though. Don't misunderstand me. I mean, the OFCCP, they don't come into these interviews trying to be nasty and mean and abrasive. That is not the way they conduct these interviews. But they may miss things. And it is important as counsel for you to make sure that the whole story is somehow getting out. If you're getting the notes from OFCCP at the end of the interview, that's a great opportunity for you to supplement with some additional things that perhaps the OFCCP didn't ask, or perhaps your witness just simply forgot because he or she was nervous. It's very important that manager witnesses review and edit the notes carefully before signing them. The OFCCP has a right to rely on them, especially if the OFCCP is heading down the path of potentially finding discrimination or a predetermination notice. And the OFCCP has sometimes quoted from some of these manager interview notes. So please make sure that when the notes come back to you, that you take the time to review and read them, edit them, adjust them, and this is not like a recorded deposition. If in the interview your witness said green and the answer is pink, then you are within your rights. Cross out the word green, write the word pink, and put your initials in there. It's not about making sure that what you said in the interview is what you said. It's about making sure that the OFCCP has a truthful, factual, thorough, and complete understanding of the employer's processes and decisions. And so with that, we'll go back to some of the questions that have come in through the chat. One of the questions that came in, I guess, early on was, does the OFCCP still send a notice of compliance or a notice of closure? And I will tell you that we just received one of these documents for a client, and the label in the subject matter line with the PDF said notice of closure, and yet the words compliance appear throughout. We found your organization to be in compliance with the laws and regulations that OFCCP enforces. And so maybe I was being a little too casual and cavalier in calling it a notice of compliance. The gist of what we were trying to convey is, at the end of OFCCP's audit, they're either going to tell you that your client is in compliance and issue a document with the word closure in the PDF subject line, or they could potentially move it on for the next phase of their administrative action, which would be a predetermination notice, and thereafter a notice of violations. And so with that, I will open it back up again to Lauren to see if there are any additional questions that may have come in that we're not monitoring.
Thank you, Alissa, James, and Nora. Actually, we do not have, well, let's put out a last call for any questions. I don't see any coming in right now, and we are nearing the end of our hour. So if we don't have anything else to cover, one last call, there we are. All right, so that'll be the last of our questions, and this will conclude today's presentation of how to approach OFCCP interviews. I'd like to thank Alissa, James, and Nora from Roffman Horvitz for their fantastic expert perspectives. Thanks to all of you, our audience, for attending. We hope to have you join us on another America's Job Exchange webinar in the future. This concludes our webinar. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.